Chapter 2. The Chain. It began with a few lights. As the train of the Taggart Line rolled toward Philadelphia, a few brilliant, scattered lights appeared in the darkness. They seemed purposeless in the empty plain, yet too powerful to have no purpose. The passengers watched them idly, without interest. The black shape of a structure came next, barely visible against the sky, then a big building, close to the tracks. The building was dark, and the reflections of the train lights streaked across the solid glass of its walls. An oncoming freight train hid the view, filling the windows with a rushing smear of noise. In a sudden break above the flat cars, the passengers saw distant structures under a faint reddish glow in the sky. The glow moved in irregular spasms, as if the structures were breathing. When the freight train vanished, they saw angular buildings wrapped in coils of steam. The rays of a few strong lights cut straight sheaves through the coils. The steam was red as the sky. The thing that came next did not look like a building, but like a shell of checkered glass enclosing girders, cranes and trusses in a solid, blinding, orange spread of flame. The passengers could not grasp the complexity of what seemed to be a city stretched for miles, active without sign of human presence. They saw towers that looked like contorted skyscrapers, bridges hanging in mid-air, and sudden wounds spurting fire from out of solid walls. They saw a line of glowing cylinders moving through the night. The cylinders were red-hot metal. An office building appeared close to the tracks. The big neon sign on its roof lighted the interiors of the coaches as they went by. It said Reardon Steel. A passenger, who was a professor of economics, remarked to his companion, "Of what importance is an individual in the titanic collective achievements of our industrial age?" Another, who was a journalist, made a note for future use in his column. "Hank Reardon is the kind of man who sticks his name on everything he touches. You may from this form your own opinion about the character of Hank Reardon." The train was speeding on into the darkness when a red gasp shot to the sky from beyond a long structure. The passengers paid no attention. One more heat of steel being poured was not an event they had been taught to notice. It was the first heat for the first order of Reardon metal. To the men at the tap-hole of the furnace inside the mills, the first break of the liquid metal into the open came as a shocking sensation of morning. The narrow streak pouring through space had the pure white color of sunlight. Black coils of steam were boiling upward, streaked with violent red. Fountains of sparks shot in beating spasms, as from broken arteries. The air seemed torn to rags, reflecting a raging flame that was not there, red blotches whirling and running through space, as if not to be contained with a man-made structure, as if about to consume the columns, the girders, the bridges of cranes overhead. But the liquid metal had no aspect of violence. It was a long, white curve with the texture of satin and the friendly radiance of a smile. It flowed obediently through a spout of clay, with two brittle borders to restrain it. It fell through 20 feet of space, down into a ladle that held 200 tons. A flow of stars hung above the stream, leaping out of its placid smoothness, looking delicate as lace and innocent as children's sparklers. Only at a closer glance could one notice that the white satin was boiling. Splashes flew out at times and fell to the ground below. They were metal, and cooling while hitting the soil, they burst into flame. 200 tons of a metal which was to be harder than steel, running liquid at a temperature of 4,000 degrees, had the power to annihilate every wall of the structure and every one of the men who worked by the stream. But every inch of its course, every pound of its pressure, and the content of every molecule within it, were controlled and made by a conscious intention that had worked upon it for 10 years. Swinging through the darkness of the shed, the red glare kept slashing the face of a man who stood in a distant corner. He stood leaning against a column, watching. The glare cut a moment's wedge across his eyes, which had the color and quality of pale blue ice, then across the black web of the metal column and the ash-blonde strands of his hair, then across the belt of his trench coat and the pockets where he held his hands. His body was tall and gaunt. He had always been too tall for those around him. His face was cut by prominent cheekbones, and by a few sharp lines. They were not the lines of age. He had always had them. This had made him look old at 20, and young now at 45. Ever since he could remember, he had been told that his face was ugly, because it was unyielding, and cruel because it was expressionless. It remained expressionless now, as he looked at the metal. He was Hank Reardon. The metal came rising to the top of the ladle and went running over with arrogant prodigality. Then the blinding white trickles turned to glowing brown, and in one more instant they were black icicles of metal starting to crumble off. The slag was crusting in thick brown ridges that looked like the crust of the earth. As the crust grew thicker, a few craters broke open, with the white liquid still boiling within. A man came riding through the air, in the cab of a crane overhead. He pulled a lever by the casual movement of one hand. Steel hooks came down on a chain, seized the handles of the ladle, lifted it smoothly like a bucket of milk, and 200 tons of metal went sailing through space toward a row of molds waiting to be filled. Hank Reardon leaned back, closing his eyes. He felt the column trembling with the rumble of the crane. The job was done, he thought. A worker saw him and grinned in understanding, like a fellow accomplice in a great celebration, who knew why that tall, blond figure had to be present here tonight. Reardon smiled in answer. It was the only salute he had ever received. Then he started back for his office, once again a figure with an expressionless face. It was late when Hank Reardon left his office that night to walk from his mills to his house. It was a walk of some miles, through empty country, but he had felt like doing it, without conscious reason. He walked, keeping one hand in his pocket, his fingers closed about a bracelet. It was made of Reardon metal, in the shape of a chain. His fingers moved, feeling its texture once in a while. It had taken 10 years to make that bracelet. 10 years, he thought, is a long time. The road was dark, edged with trees. Looking up, he could see a few leaves against the stars. The leaves were twisted and dry, ready to fall. There were distant lights in the windows of houses scattered through the countryside, but the lights made the road seem lonelier. He never felt loneliness except when he was happy. He turned, once in a while, to look back at the red glow of the sky over the mills. He did not think of the 10 years. What remained of them tonight was only a feeling which he could not name, except that it was quiet and solemn. The feeling was a sum, and he did not have to count again the parts that had gone to make it. But the parts, unrecalled, were there, within the feeling. They were the nights spent at scorching ovens in the research laboratory of the mills, the nights spent in the workshop of his home, over sheets of paper which he filled with formulas, then tore up in angry failure. The days when the young scientists of the small staff he had chosen to assist him waited for instructions like soldiers ready for a hopeless battle, having exhausted their ingenuity, still willing but silent, with the unspoken sentence hanging in the air, "Mr. Reardon, it can't be done." The meals, interrupted and abandoned at the sudden flash of a new thought, a thought to be pursued at once, to be tried, to be tested, to be worked on for months, and to be discarded as another failure. The moments snatched from conferences, from contracts, from the duties of running the best steel mills in the country, snatched almost guiltily, as for a secret love. The one thought held immovable, across a span of 10 years, under everything he did and everything he saw. The thought held in his mind when he looked at the buildings of a city, at the track of a railroad, at the light in the windows of a distant farmhouse, at the knife in the hands of a beautiful woman cutting a piece of fruit at a banquet. The thought of a metal alloy that would do more than steel had ever done. A metal that would be to steel what steel had been to iron. The acts of self-racking when he discarded a hope or a sample, not permitting himself to know that he was tired, not giving himself time to feel, driving himself through the ringing torture of not good enough, still not good enough, and going on with no motor save the conviction that it could be done. Then the day when it was done, and its result was called Reardon metal. These were the things that had come to white heat, had melted and fused within him, and their alloy was a strange, quiet feeling that made him smile at the countryside in the darkness and wonder why happiness could hurt. After a while, he realized that he was thinking of his past, as if certain days of it were spread before him, demanding to be seen again. He did not want to look at them. He despised memories as a pointless indulgence, but then he understood that he thought of them tonight in honor of that piece of metal in his pocket. Then he permitted himself to look. He saw the day when he stood on a rocky ledge and felt a thread of sweat running from his temple down his neck. He was 14 years old, and it was his first day of work on the iron mines of Minnesota. He was trying to learn to breathe against the scalding pain in his chest. He stood, cursing himself, because he had made up his mind that he would not be tired. After a while he went back to his task. He decided that pain was not a valid reason for stopping. He saw the day when he stood at the window of his office and looked at the mines. He owned them as of that morning. He was 30 years old. What had gone on in the years between did not matter, just as pain had not mattered. He had worked in mines, in foundries, and steel mills of the north, moving toward the purpose he had chosen. All he remembered of those jobs was that the men around him had never seemed to know what to do. Well, he had always known. He remembered wondering why so many iron mines were closing, just as these had been about to close until he took them over. He looked at the shelves of rock in the distance. Workers were putting up a new sign above a gate at the end of the road. Reardon Ore. He saw an evening when he sat slumped across his desk in that office. It was late and his staff had left, so he could lie there alone, unwitnessed. He was tired. It was as if he had run a race against his own body, and all the exhaustion of years which he had refused to acknowledge had caught him at once and flattened him against the desktop. He felt nothing, except the desire not to move. He did not have the strength to feel, not even to suffer. He had burned everything there was to burn within him. He had scattered so many sparks to start so many things, and now he wondered whether someone could give him now the spark he needed, now when he felt unable to ever rise again. He asked himself who had started him and kept him going. Then he raised his head. Slowly, with the greatest effort of his life, he made his body rise until he was able to sit upright with only one hand pressed to the desk and a trembling arm to support him. He never asked that question again. He saw the day when he stood on a hill and looked at a grimy wasteland of structures that had been a steel plant. It was closed and given up. He had bought it the night before. There was a strong wind and a gray light squeezed from among the clouds. In that light he saw the brown red of rust like dead blood on the steel of the giant cranes, and bright green living weeds like gorged cannibals growing over piles of broken glass at the foot of walls made of empty frames. At a gate in the distance he saw the black silhouettes of men. They were the unemployed from the rotting hovels of what had once been a prosperous town. They stood silently, looking at the glittering car he had left at the gate of the mills. They wondered whether the man on the hill was the Hank Reardon that people were talking about, and whether it was true that the mills were to be reopened. The historical cycle of steel-making in Pennsylvania is obviously running down, a newspaper had said, and experts agree that Hank Reardon's venture into steel is hopeless. You may soon witness the sensational end of the sensational Henry Reardon. That was 10 years ago. Tonight, the cold wind on his face felt like the wind of that day. He turned to look back. The red glow of the mills breathed in the sky, a sight as life-giving as a sunrise. These had been his stops, the stations which an express had reached and passed. He remembered nothing distinct of the years between them. The years were blurred, like a streak of speed. Whatever it was, he thought, whatever the strain and the agony, they were worth it, because they had made him reach this day when the first heat of the first order of Reardon metal had been poured, to become rails for Taggart Transcontinental. He touched the bracelet in his pocket. He had had it made from that first poured metal. It was for his wife. As he touched it, he realized suddenly that he thought of an abstraction called his wife, not of the woman to whom he was married. He felt a stab of regret, wishing he had not made the bracelet, then a wave of self-reproach for the regret. He shook his head. This was not the time for his old doubts. He felt that he could forgive anything to anyone, because happiness was the greatest agent of purification. He felt certain that every living being wished him well tonight. He wanted to meet someone, to face the first stranger, to stand disarmed and open and say, "Look at me." People, he thought, were as hungry for a sight of joy as he had always been, for a moment's relief from that grey load of suffering, which seemed so inexplicable and unnecessary. He had never been able to understand why men should be unhappy. The dark road had risen imperceptibly to the top of a hill. He stopped and turned. The red glow was a narrow strip far to the west. Above it, small at a distance of miles, the words of a neon sign stood written on the blackness of the sky, Reardon Steel. He stood straight, as if before a bench of judgment. He thought that, in the darkness of this night, other signs were lighted over the country. Reardon Ore, Reardon Coal, Reardon Limestone. He thought of the days behind him. He wished it were possible to light a neon sign above them, saying, Reardon Life. He turned sharply and walked on. As the road came closer to his house, he noticed that his steps were slowing down, and that something was ebbing away from his mood. He felt a dim reluctance to enter his home, which he did not want to feel. No, he thought, not tonight. They'll understand it tonight. But he did not know. He had never defined what it was that he wanted them to understand. He saw lights in the windows of the living room when he approached his house. The house stood on a hill, rising before him like a big white bulk. It looked naked, with a few semi-colonial pillars for reluctant ornament. It had the cheerless look of a nudity not worth revealing. He was not certain whether his wife noticed him when he entered the living room. She sat by the fireplace talking, the curve of her arm floating in graceful emphasis of her words. He heard a small break in her voice and thought that she had seen him, but she did not look up, and her sentence went on smoothly. He could not be certain. But it's just that a man of culture is bored with the alleged wonders of purely material ingenuity, she was saying. He simply refuses to get excited about plumbing. Then she turned her head, looked at Reardon in the shadows across the long room, and her arms spread gracefully like two swan necks by her sides. "Why, darling," she said in a bright tone of amusement, "isn't it too early to come home? Wasn't there some slag to sweep or tuyere to polish?" They all turned to him, his mother, his brother Philip, and Paul Larkin, their old friend. "I'm sorry," he answered. "I know I'm late." "Don't say you're sorry," said his mother. "You could have telephoned." He looked at her, trying vaguely to remember something. "You promised to be here for dinner tonight." "Oh, that's right, I did. I'm sorry, but today at the mills we poured—" He stopped. He did not know what made him unable to utter the one thing he had come home to say. He added only, "It's just that I forgot." "That's what Mother means," said Philip. "Oh, let him get his bearings. He's not quite here yet. He's still at the mills," his wife said gaily. "Do take off your coat, Henry." Paul Larkin was looking at him with the devoted eyes of an inhibited dog. "Hello, Paul," said Reardon. "When did you get in?" "Oh, I just hopped down on the 5:35 from New York." Larkin was smiling in gratitude for the attention. "Trouble?" "Who hasn't got trouble these days?" Larkin's smile became resigned, to indicate that the remark was merely philosophical. "But no special trouble this time. I just thought I'd drop in to see you." His wife laughed. "You've disappointed him, Paul." She turned to Reardon. "Is it an inferiority complex or a superiority one, Henry? Do you believe that nobody can want to see you for just your own sake, or do you believe that nobody can get along without your help?" He wanted to utter an angry denial, but she was smiling at him as if this were merely a conversational joke, and he had no capacity for the sort of conversations which were not supposed to be meant, so he did not answer. He stood looking at her, wondering about the things he had never been able to understand. Lillian Reardon was generally regarded as a beautiful woman. She had a tall, graceful body, the kind that looked well in high-waisted gowns of the Empire style, which she made it a practice to wear. Her exquisite profile belonged to a cameo of the same period. Its pure, proud lines and the lustrous light brown waves of her hair, worn with classical simplicity, suggested an austere, imperial beauty. But when she turned full face, people experienced a small shock of disappointment. Her face was not beautiful. The eyes were the flaw. They were vaguely pale, neither quite grey nor brown, lifelessly empty of expression. Reardon had always wondered, since she seemed amused so often, why there was no gaiety in her face. "We have met before, dear," she said, in answer to his silent scrutiny, "though you don't seem to be sure of it." "Have you had any dinner, Henry?" his mother asked. There was a reproachful impatience in her voice, as if his hunger were a personal insult to her. "Yes. No, I wasn't hungry." "I'd better ring them to have them." "No, Mother, not now. It doesn't matter." "Ah, that's the trouble I've always had with you." She was not looking at him, but reciting words into space. "It's no use trying to do things for you. You don't appreciate it. I could never make you eat properly." "Henry, you work too hard," said Philip. "It's not good for you." Reardon laughed. "I like it." "That's what you tell yourself. It's a form of neurosis, you know. When a man drowns himself in work, it's because he's trying to escape from something. You ought to have a hobby." "Oh, Phil," he said, and regretted the irritation in his voice. Phil had always been in a precarious health, though doctors had found no specific defect in his loose, gangling body. He was 38, but his chronic weariness made people think at times that he was older than his brother. "You ought to learn to have some fun," said Philip. "Otherwise you'll become dull and narrow, single-tracked, you know. You ought to get out of your little private shell and take a look at the world. You don't want to miss life, the way you're doing." Fighting anger, Reardon told himself that this was Philip's form of solicitude. He told himself that it would be unjust to feel resentment, They were all trying to show their concern for him, and he wished these were not the things they had chosen for concern. "I had a pretty good time today, Phil," he answered, smiling, and wondered why Philip did not ask him what it was. He wished one of them would ask him. He was finding it hard to concentrate. The sight of the running metal was still burned into his mind, filling his consciousness, leaving no room for anything else. "You might have apologized, only I ought to know better than to expect it." It was his mother's voice. He turned. She was looking at him with that injured look which proclaims the long-bearing patience of the defenseless. "Mrs. Beecham was here for dinner," she said reproachfully. "What?" "Mrs. Beecham. My friend, Mrs. Beecham." "Yes." "I told her about you." I told you about her." "I told you many times, but you never remember anything I say. Mrs. Beecham was so anxious to meet you, but she had to leave after dinner. She couldn't wait. Mrs. Beecham is a very busy person. She wanted so much to tell you about the wonderful work we're doing in our parish school, and about the classes in metal craftsmanship, and about the beautiful wrought iron doorknobs that the little Slum children are making all by themselves." It took the whole of his sense of consideration to force himself to answer evenly. "I'm sorry if I've disappointed you, Mother." "You're not sorry. You could have been here if you'd made the effort. But when did you ever make an effort for anybody but yourself? You're not interested in any of us or in anything we do. You think that if you pay the bills, that's enough, don't you? Money, that's all you know. And all you give us is money. Have you ever given us any time?" If this meant that she missed him, he thought, then it meant affection. And if it meant affection, then he was unjust to experience a heavy, murky feeling, which kept him silent lest his voice betray that the feeling was disgust. "You don't care." Her voice went half spitting, half begging on. "Lillian needed you today for a very important problem, but I told her it was no use waiting to discuss it with you." "Oh, Mother, it's not important," said Lillian. "Not to Henry." He turned to her. He stood in the middle of the room with his trench coat still on, as if he were trapped in an unreality that would not become real to him. "It's not important at all," said Lillian gaily. He could not tell whether her voice was apologetic or boastful. "It's not business. It's purely non-commercial." "What is it?" "Just a party I'm planning to give." "A party?" "Oh, don't look frightened. It's not for tomorrow night. I know that you are so very busy, but it's for 3 months from now, and I want it to be a very big, very special affair. So would you promise me to be here that night, and not in Minnesota, or Colorado, or California?" She was looking at him in an odd manner, speaking too lightly and too purposefully at once, her smile overstressing an air of innocence and suggesting something like a hidden trump card. 3 months from now," he said. "But you know that I can't tell what urgent business might come up to call me out of town." "Oh, I know. But couldn't I make a formal appointment with you, way in advance, just like any railroad executive, automobile manufacturer, or scrap dealer? They say you never miss an appointment. Of course, I'd let you pick the date to suit your convenience." She was looking up at him, her glance acquiring some special quality of feminine appeal by being sent from under her lowered forehead up toward his full height. She asked, a little too casually and too cautiously, "The date I had in mind was December 10th, but would you prefer the 9th or the 11th? "It makes no difference to me." She said gently, "December 10th is our wedding anniversary, Henry." They were all watching his face, as if they expected a look of guilt. What they saw instead was a faint smile of amusement. She could not have intended this as a trap, he thought, because he could escape it so easily, by refusing to accept any blame for his forgetfulness, and by leaving her spurned. She knew that his feeling for her was her only weapon. Her motive, he thought, was a proudly indirect attempt to test his feeling and to confess her own. The party was not his form of celebration, but it was hers. It meant nothing in his terms. In hers it meant the best tribute she could offer to him and to their marriage. He had to respect her intention, he thought, even if he did not share her standards, even if he did not know whether he still cared for any tribute from her. He had to let her win, he thought, because she had thrown herself upon his mercy. He smiled, an open, unresentful smile in acknowledgment of her victory. "All right, Lillian," he said quietly. "I promise to be here on the night of December 10th. "Thank you, dear." Her smile had a closed, mysterious quality. He wondered why he had a moment's impression that his attitude had disappointed them all. If she trusted him, he thought, If her feeling for him was still alive, then he would match her trust. He had to say it. Words were a lens to focus one's mind, and he could not use words for anything else tonight. "I'm sorry I'm late, Lillian, but today at the mills we poured to the first heat of Reardon metal." There was a moment of silence. Then Philip said, "Well, that's nice." The others said nothing. He put his hand in his pocket. When he touched it, the reality of the bracelet swept out everything else. He felt as he had felt when the liquid metal had poured through space before him. "I brought you a present, Lillian." He did not know that he stood straight, and that the gesture of his arm was that of a returning crusader offering his trophy to his love when he dropped a small chain of metal into her lap. Lillian Reardon picked it up, hooked on the tips of 2 straight fingers, and raised it to the light. The links were heavy, crudely made. The shining metal had an odd tinge. It was greenish-blue. "What's that?" she asked. "The first thing made from the first heat of the first order of Reardon metal." "You mean," she said, "it's fully as valuable as a piece of railroad rails?" He looked at her blankly. She jingled the bracelet, making it sparkle under the light. "Henry, it's perfectly wonderful. What originality! I shall be the sensation of New York, wearing jewelry made of the same stuff as bridge girders, truck motors, kitchen stoves, typewriters, and— what was it you were saying about it the other day, darling? Soup kettles." "God, Henry, but you're conceited," said Philip. Lillian laughed. "He's a sentimentalist. All men are. But, darling, I do appreciate it. It isn't the gift, it's the intention, I know." "The intention's plain selfishness, if you ask me," said Reardon's mother. "Any other man would bring a diamond bracelet if he wanted to give his wife a present, because it's her pleasure he'd think of, not his own. But Henry thinks that just because he's made a new kind of tin, why, it's got to be more precious than diamonds to everybody, just because it's he that's made it. That's the way he's been since he was 5 years old, the most conceited brat you ever saw, and I knew he'd grow up to be the most selfish creature on God's earth." "No, it's sweet," said Lillian. "It's charming." She dropped the bracelet down on the table. She got up, put her hands on Reardon's shoulders, and raising herself on tiptoe, kissed him on the cheek, saying, "Thank you, dear." He did not move. He did not bend his head down to her. After a while he turned, took off his coat, and sat down by the fire, apart from the others. He felt nothing but an immense exhaustion. He did not listen to their talk. He heard dimly that Lillian was arguing, defending him against his mother. "I know him better than you do," his mother was saying. "Hank Reardon's not interested in man, beast, or weed unless it's tied in some way to himself and his work. That's all he cares about. I've tried my best to teach him some humility. I've tried all my life, but I've failed." He had offered his mother unlimited means to live as and where she pleased. He wondered why she had insisted that she wanted to live with him. His success, he had thought, meant something to her, and if it did, then it was a bond between them, the only kind of bond he recognized. If she wanted a place in the home of her successful son, he would not deny it to her. "It's no use hoping to make a saint out of Henry, Mother," said Philip. "He wasn't meant to be one." "Oh, but Philip, you're wrong," said Lillian. "You're so wrong. Henry has all the makings of a saint. That's the trouble." What did they seek from him, thought Reardon? What were they after? He had never asked anything of them. It was they who wished to hold him, they who pressed a claim on him, and the claim seemed to have the form of affection, but it was a form which he found harder to endure than any sort of hatred. He despised causeless affection, just as he despised unearned wealth. They professed to love him for some unknown reason, and they ignored all the things for which he could wish to be loved. He wondered what response they could hope to obtain from him in such manner, if his response was what they wanted. And it was, he thought. Else why those constant complaints, those unceasing accusations about his indifference? Why that chronic air of suspicion, as if they were waiting to be hurt? He had never had a desire to hurt them, but he always felt their defensive, reproachful expectation. They seemed wounded by anything he said. It was not a matter of his words or actions, it was almost as if they were wounded by the mere fact of his being. "Don't start imagining the insane," he told himself severely, struggling to face the riddle with the strictest of his ruthless sense of justice. He could not condemn them without understanding, and he could not understand. Did he like them? No, he thought. He had wanted to like them, which was not the same. He had wanted it in the name of some unstated potentiality, which he had once expected to see in any human being. He felt nothing for them now. Nothing but the merciless zero of indifference, not even the regret of a loss. Did he need any person as part of his life? Did he miss the feeling he had wanted to feel? No, he thought. Had he ever missed it? Yes, he thought, in his youth. Not any longer. His sense of exhaustion was growing. He realized that it was boredom. He owed them the courtesy of hiding it, he thought, and sat motionless, fighting a desire for sleep that was turning into physical pain. His eyes were closing when he felt two soft, moist fingers touching his hand. Paul Larkin had pulled a chair to his side and was leaning over for a private conversation. I don't care what the industry says about it, Hank. You've got a great product in Reardon metal. A great product. It will make a fortune, like everything you touch. Yes, said Reardon. It will. I just hope you don't run into trouble. What trouble? Oh, I don't know. The way things are nowadays, there's people who... But how can we tell? Anything can happen. What trouble? Larkin sat hunched, looking up with his gentle, pleading eyes. His short, plumpish figure always seemed unprotected and incomplete, as if he needed a shell to shrink into at the slightest touch. His wistful eyes, his lost, helpless, appealing smile, served as substitute for the shell. The smile was disarming, like that of a boy who throws himself at the mercy of an incomprehensible universe. He was 53 years old. Your public relations aren't any too good, Hank, he said. You've always had a bad press. So what? You're not popular, Hank. I haven't heard any complaints from my customers. That's not what I meant. You ought to hire yourself a good press agent to sell you to the public. What for? It's steel that I'm selling. But you don't want to have the public against you. Public opinion, you know. It can mean a lot. I don't think the public's against me, and I don't think that it means a damn, one way or another. The newspapers are against you. They have time to waste. I haven't. I don't like it, Hank. It's not good. What? What they write about you. What do they write about me? Well, you know the stuff. That you're intractable. That you're ruthless. That you won't allow anyone any voice in the running of your mills. That your only goal is to make steel and to make money. But that is my only goal. But you shouldn't say it. Why not? What is it I'm supposed to say? Oh, I don't know. But your mills. They're my mills, aren't they? Yes, but you shouldn't remind people of that too loudly. You know how it is nowadays. They think that your attitude is antisocial. I don't give a damn what they think. Paul Larkin sighed. What's the matter, Paul? What are you driving at? Nothing in particular. Only one never knows what can happen in times like these. One has to be so careful. Reardon chuckled. You're not trying to worry about me, are you? It's just that I'm your friend, Hank. I'm your friend. You know how much I admire you. Paul Larkin had always been unlucky. Nothing he touched ever came off quite well. Nothing ever quite failed or succeeded. He was a businessman, but he could not manage to remain for long in any one line of business. At the moment he was struggling with a modest plant that manufactured mining equipment. He had clung to Reardon for years, in awed admiration. He came for advice. He asked for loans at times, but not often. The loans were modest and were always repaid, though not always on time. His motive in the relationship seemed to resemble the need of an anemic person who receives a kind of living transfusion from the mere sight of a savagely overabundant vitality. Watching Larkin's efforts, Reardon felt what he did when he watched an ant struggling under the load of a matchstick. It's so hard for him, thought Reardon, and so easy for me. So he gave advice, attention, and a tactful, patient interest whenever he could. I'm your friend, Hank. Reardon looked at him inquiringly. Larkin glanced away, as if debating something in his mind. After a while, he asked cautiously, How's your man in Washington? Okay, I guess. You ought to be sure of it. It's important. He looked up at Reardon and repeated with a kind of stressed insistence, as if discharging a painful moral duty. Hank, it's very important. I suppose so. In fact, that's what I came here to tell you. For any special reason? Larkin considered it and decided that the duty was discharged. No, he said. Reardon disliked the subject. He knew that it was necessary to have a man to protect him from the legislator. All industrialists had to employ such men. but he had never given much attention to this aspect of his business. He could not quite convince himself that it was necessary. An inexplicable kind of distaste, part fastidiousness, part boredom, stopped him whenever he tried to consider it. "Trouble is, Paul," he said, thinking aloud, "that the men one has to pick for that job are such a crummy lot." Larkin looked away. "That's life," he said. "Damned if I see why. Can you tell me that? What's wrong with the world?" Larkin shrugged sadly. "Why ask useless questions? How deep is the ocean? How high is the sky? Who is John Galt?" Reardon sat up straight. "No," he said sharply. "No, there's no reason to feel that way." He got up. His exhaustion had gone while he had talked about his business. He felt a sudden spurt of rebellion, a need to recapture and defiantly to reassert his own view of existence, that sense of it which he had held while walking home tonight and which now seemed threatened in some nameless manner. He paced the room, his energy returning. He looked at his family. They were bewildered, unhappy children, he thought. All of them, even his mother, and he was foolish to resent their ineptitude. It came from their helplessness, not from their malice. It was he who had to make himself learn to understand them, since he had so much to give, since they could never share his sense of joyous, boundless power. He glanced at them from across the room. His mother and Philip were engaged in some eager discussion, but he noted that they were not really eager, they were nervous. Philip sat in a low chair, his stomach forward, his weight on his shoulder blades, as if the miserable discomfort of his position were intended to punish the onlookers. "What's the matter, Phil?" Reardon asked, approaching him. He looked in. "I've had a hard day," said Philip sullenly. "You're not the only one who works hard," said his mother. "Others have problems, too, even if they're not billion-dollar, trans-supercontinental problems like yours." "Why, that's good. I always thought that Phil should find some interest of his own." "Good? You mean you like to see your brother sweating his health away? It amuses you, doesn't it? I always thought it did." "Why, no, Mother. I'd like to help." "You don't have to help. You don't have to feel anything for any of us." Reardon had never known what his brother was doing or wished to do. He had sent Philip through college, but Philip had not been able to decide on any specific ambition. There was something wrong, by Reardon's standards, with a man who did not seek any gainful employment, but he would not impose his standards on Philip. He could afford to support his brother and never notice the expense. Let him take it easy, Reardon had thought for years. Let him have a chance to choose his career without the strain of struggling for a livelihood. "What were you doing today, Phil?" he asked patiently. "It wouldn't interest you." "It does interest me. That's why I'm asking. I had to see 20 different people all over the place, from here to Reading to Wilmington." "What did you have to see them about?" "I am trying to raise money for Friends of Global Progress." Reardon had never been able to keep track of the many organizations to which Philip belonged, nor to get a clear idea of their activities. He had heard Philip talking vaguely about this one for the last 6 months. It seemed to be devoted to some sort of free lectures on psychology, folk music, and cooperative farming. Reardon felt contempt for groups of that kind and saw no reason for a closer inquiry into their nature. He remained silent. Philip added without being prompted, "We need to raise $10,000 for a vital program, but it's a martyr's task trying to raise money. There's not a speck of social conscience left in people. When I think of the kind of bloated moneybags I saw today, why, they spend more than that on any whim, but I couldn't squeeze just $100 apiece out of them, which was all I asked. They have no sense of moral duty, no—" "What are you laughing at?" he asked sharply. Reardon stood before him, grinning. It was so childishly blatant, thought Reardon, so helplessly crude, the hint and the insult offered together. It would be so easy to squash Philip by returning the insult, he thought. By returning an insult which would be deadly, because it would be true, that he could not bring himself to utter it. Surely, he thought, the poor fool knows he's at my mercy. Knows he's opened himself to be hurt, so I don't have to do it. And my not doing it is my best answer, which he won't be able to miss. What sort of misery does he really live in, to get himself twisted quite so bad? And then Reardon thought suddenly that he could break through Philip's chronic wretchedness for once, give him a shock of pleasure, the unexpected gratification of a hopeless desire. He thought, what do I care about the nature of his desire? It's his, just as Reardon Meadow was mine. It must mean to him what that meant to me. Let's see him happy just once. It might teach him something. Didn't I say that happiness is the agent of purification? I'm celebrating tonight, so let him share in it. It will be so much from him and so little for me. "Philip," he said, smiling, "call Miss Ives at my office tomorrow. She'll have a check for you for $10,000. Philip stared at him blankly. It was neither shock nor pleasure. It was just the empty stare of eyes that looked glassy. "Oh," said Philip, then added, "We'll appreciate it very much." There was no emotion in his voice, not even the simple one of greed. Reardon could not understand his own feeling. It was as if something leaden and empty were collapsing within him. He felt both the weight and the emptiness together. He knew it was disappointment, but he wondered why it was so grey and ugly. "It's very nice of you, Henry," Philip said dryly. "I'm surprised. I didn't expect it of you." "Don't you understand it, Phil?" said Lillian, her voice peculiarly clear and lilting. "Henry's poured his medal today." She turned to Reardon. "Shall we declare it a national holiday, darling?" "You're a good man, Henry," said his mother, and added, "but not often enough." Reardon stood looking at Philip, as if waiting. Philip looked away, then raised his eyes and held Reardon's glance, as if engaged in a scrutiny of his own. "You don't really care about helping the underprivileged, do you?" Philip asked, and Reardon heard, unable to believe it, that the tone of his voice was reproachful. "No, Phil, I don't care about it at all. I only wanted you to be happy." "But that money is not for me. I am not collecting it for any personal motive. I have no selfish interest in the matter whatever." His voice was cold, with a note of self-conscious virtue. Reardon turned away. He felt a sudden loathing, not because the words were hypocrisy, but because they were true. Philip meant them. "By the way, Henry," Philip added, "do you mind if I ask you to have Miss Ives give me the money in cash?" Reardon turned back to him, puzzled. "You see, Friends of Global Progress are a very progressive group, and they have always maintained that you represent the blackest element of social retrogression in the country, so it would embarrass us, you know, to have your name on our list of contributors, because somebody might accuse us of being in the pay of Hank Reardon." He wanted to slap Philip's face, but an almost unendurable contempt made him close his eyes instead. "All right," he said quietly. "You can have it in cash." He walked away to the farthest window of the room, and stood looking at the glow of the mills in the distance. He heard Larkin's voice crying after him, "Damn it, Hank, you shouldn't have given it to him." Then Lillian's voice came cold and gay. "But you're wrong, Paul, you're so wrong. What would happen to Henry's vanity if he didn't have us to throw alms to? What would become of his strength if he didn't have weaker people to dominate? What would he do with himself if he didn't keep us around as dependents? It's quite all right, really. I'm not criticizing him. It's just a law of human nature." She took the metal bracelet and held it up, letting it glitter in the lamplight. "A chain," she said. "Appropriate, isn't it? It's the chain by which he holds us all in bondage."